Hong Kong's High Court declared on Monday that the anti-mask law enacted by the SAR government in October is unconstitutional. The ruling says that it is incompatible with the basic law, the so-called mini-constitution of Hong Kong. The news broke amid a standoff between the police and rioters at the Hong Kong Polytechnic University, which started on Sunday afternoon. Rioters had used petrol bombs, metal balls, arrows and bricks against the police, while the police fired tear gas and water cannon to try to disperse the crowd. One police officer was injured by an arrow. Now, the police issued a statement on Monday appealing to everyone inside the Polytechnic University to drop their weapons and dangerous items, remove their gas masks and leave. Some, however, are describing the standoff as a siege or raid by the police and even comparing this to a massacre. What really is going on? I'm joined by Professor Teng Ji-Meng, Professor of Media Studies at the Alliance Program at Beijing Language and Culture University, and from Hong Kong by Lawrence Ma, Barrister and Chairman from the Hong Kong Legal Exchange Foundation. Gentlemen, welcome to The Point. So, the court ruling says, and Mr. Ma, I'm going to you, the court ruling says that it holds that the Emergency Regulations Ordinance, or ERO, insofar as it empowers the Chief Executive to make regulations on any occasion of public danger, is incompatible with the basic law, having regard in particular to Articles 2, 8, 17, 18, 48, 56, 62, 66 and 63 thereof. The court leaves open the question of the constitutionality of the ERO insofar as it relates to any occasion of emergency. Mr. Ma, please help us understand exactly what the ruling is saying.
Well, at the early start of the riots, the government wanted to utilize this 1922 legislation. Now, this legislation confers by the legislator or the legislature a power to the executive for the executive to make regulations during emergency time. Why? Because during emergency time, the situation is fluid, and therefore, it would be too late to propose any law in the legislature for the legislature to have a debate and then to pass the law. It would be too long to deal with any emergency situation.
So
now,
what will
that's the whole basis.
Okay, so what is the fate of this anti-mask law now? Does it mean that the government has to take it back, although it has not been very effective anyways, Mr. Ma?
Well, the government has two alternatives. First is to live with it. That means there's the end of the matter. You cannot prosecute anyone who wore a mask during protests since the beginning of the law. Or the alternative is to appeal, to seek a stay of the orders of the court and appeal to a higher court, which is the Court of Appeal.
Yeah, so what do you think the government is likely to do? And what, more importantly, will this ruling, this initial ruling, how will it impact the situation on the ground, namely the standoff that is ongoing between police and young rioters on the campuses? Well,
the further ramification of this ruling is that Hong Kong government will be left with no legal weapon to deal with any emergency situations that endangers public security. So this situation now, there's no local law now in Hong Kong that allows the government to have any emergency power to deal with any current turmoil.
So basically, Professor Teng, let me ask you then, what do you think is going to be the impact on the situation? Does that further embolden the people who are breaking the law on the streets of Hong Kong, especially on the campuses of Hong Kong, now that the government has been ruled, their act has been ruled unconstitutional?
Well, absolutely. I think the situation might deteriorate because of this very sort of announcement or a judgment by the court. I think on the one hand, it will continue to embolden or even empower those student-turned radicals or rioters on campus to engage in even more violent activities on campus. But what I want to reiterate at this point is that, I mean, a university campus is not a lawless land. It's not supposed to be a land that people can seek shelter from law. I mean, basically, it is still covered by the law, by the PRC, by the basic law, and no excuse shall be provided to cover and to shelter these criminals.
Mr. Ma, last week we talked about it, but I want to ask you again. I mean, there are people who are describing what the police is doing as some kind of raid, as some kind of siege of university campuses. But the court has upheld an order whereby they declare it is within the police's rights, right, to enact law on university campuses. So, how do you look at the situation? What kind of word would you use to describe the police operations around the university campuses?
Well, the court has refused an injunction by some pro-democratic legislators to seek an order of judicial review that police has no power to enforce laws on university grounds, which was rejected. So that in that regard, university ground is being treated no different from other land in Hong Kong, which the police's power to enforce the law is widespread and covering all territories of Hong Kong.
Mm-hmm. I want to go a little bit deeper to the situation, and it's really heartbreaking to see these images and those young people. I mean, some of them still in their teens, I believe, and some of them in their early 20s. And Professor Tung, you have taught on the campuses of Hong Kong for almost a year. I want to ask, what do you think have driven these young people to be so radicalized, to break the law to such a degree, and sometimes they're doing things which seems like they have lost their mind? What do you think are the forces that are driving them at this moment?
Well, generally speaking, I think something must be wrong, and what is wrong basically is the very central core of this very educational system. We all know that Hong Kong actually adopted some kind of independent, quote-unquote, education system even during the colonial times, ruled by the British Empire. But then after the handover, basically everything changed. If back in the past, Chinese history, world history, were all actually offered to students, and they were taught in a very, very, in a sense, honest and in a sense, real Chinese way, let me put it this way, because Chinese history, Chinese historiography were taught. Students were, for example, taught to read several of the great classics, like the records of the grand historian Shi Ji, and also Zizhi Tongjian, for example, the great classical writings of politicization. All these are actually classics being taught on campus. It is supposed to be Chinese historiography. It was part of our heritage. It's taught in beautiful classical Chinese language. It's part of our DNA already. I mean, if you look at, for example, education before 1997, 90% of the Hong Kong residents are actually thinking that they are Chinese. But then after the handover, the situation seems to be collapsing.
Because they were not compulsively taught their own history, right? History of China. And Mr. Ma, what is your take on the situation? Of course, not from a legal perspective, but your observation of what are the forces that have driven these young people to this far? Are they really doing this because they have been pushed without a choice, that they have been angered or cornered, so that they are taking up some kind of self-defense? Or are they being used as some kind of political tools by the people who have, you know, political goals to reach, or something else? What is your take on the situation?
Well, the democracy has been very much so fantasized by by the Western media. There has been a constant smearing of the Communist Party regime and any government regime in the mainland China by a Hong Kong local newspaper, and also by a lot of Western medias who want to launch a propaganda against the Chinese Communist regime, so that Hong Kong is a place where the Western media and anti-communist regime has found its root here, and those newspapers has been over time and years have been inculcating ideas into the youth that that China is no good, that communists are bad people.
How come? I mean, Hong Kong has been back to Chinese rule after since 20 years. How come nothing was done to this? Were there not enough force, not enough effectiveness from the central government side, from the Chinese people's side, to counter that kind of bad influence, Mr. Ma?
Well, I don't think that the system of the propaganda system in the mainland China has no reach on Hong Kong soil. Hong Kong still has a very independent press. Hong Kong has a freedom of expression, which you can say whatever things you want to say. So if you consider Hong Kong, there's a place of conflict between West and East, and two different socialist system and the capitalist system, and different geographical, geopolitical interests. There is a propaganda fight between these two camps. And our Chinese camp has lost the battle, I'm afraid.
Professor Tung, your take on the situation. Has the Chinese side lost the battle in this ideological conflict, on this media tug of war between the liberalists and the Chinese way of thinking?
Yeah, sure. I mean, but I don't think
and
it is supposed to be...
And the young students are being kind of victims in this fight.
Yeah, I mean, they are basically, to me, the victims of this very propaganda, perhaps brainwashing. I don't think that China failed. Mainland Chinese see propaganda, or basically our news, our education failed. But I think the Western media and also the so-called democracy system out there in Hong Kong really ruled out. They have been very, very selective in picking what to teach and what to disseminate in a society who claim itself as a civil society with free press and freedom of expression and that sort of thing. And so, in a sense, they should open up to more in terms of the choices, and Chinese mainland can provide that choice. And they simply ignore that very choice. I know that part of the Chinese history has been torn away from their history books.
It's very peculiar because on the one hand we talk about Hong Kong being a very open society, being a very free society of access to all kinds of information. On the other hand, to the information from the mainland towards China's development, it seems they're rather closed, Mr. Ma. Very briefly, please.
Well, I don't know what to answer to that, but I mean, Hong Kong is close to China, but the problem is Hong Kong is pretty receptive to Western ideas and Western ideologies. Hong Kong people, many of them, particularly the young ones, they refuse to go to the mainland China. They refuse to read simplified characters. So although we are only separated by one river, there is really a mental blockage, a mental resistance towards anything that's from China.
All right, we have to leave it there. Very complicated issue and very serious topic. I hope we have more time to talk about it in the near future. Many thanks to Professor Tung Chee-mung from Beijing Language and Culture University and Lawrence Ma from Hong Kong Legal Exchange Foundation.